Hello and welcome to Putting the Ops in DevOps. My name is Mike Vizard. I'm your friendly neighborhood moderator for this event. And today we're going to be talking about how IT operations and DevOps can come together and work hand in glove. But first, a few housekeeping notes. The first thing we want to make note of is the fact that this is being recorded, so you all know exactly what's going to happen in the future and you might be able to view it again. Second thing is there are questions that you can ask. We encourage you to ask as many questions as you like during the course of the presentation. And finally, there's going to be polls that we're going to ask you all to participate in. Our speakers today are Anand Thumalapi, who's Vice President of Product Management for Gen E at IBM, and James Moore, who is Principal Offering Manager, also with IBM. And with that, James, take it away.
All right, thanks, Mike. Yeah, this is James Moore. So I have responsibility for some of our new cloud-based offerings. What we want to go through today is, as the title says, is how operations best practices and some of the methodologies and tools, best practices developed over the years can benefit organizations that are taking a DevOps approach. So Anand will be joining me and sharing some of his perspective on this topic and some examples of some of the best practices in use, hopefully to everyone's benefit. So some of the things we want to cover, we really are starting to see some trends based on what's happening in the industry today across different types of companies. We're seeing some common threads. Of course, a lot of people are talking about agile development, agile management overall. There's a ton of attention, of course, on cloud, both private cloud-based deployments and public cloud. We see a lot of movement towards both, and those factors and those methodologies surrounding some of those trends are really bringing up new opportunities, but also some new challenges and some common challenges that to some may be new, but to others may be something they've experienced for years on end. So we'll touch some on that, and we'll get a feel, hopefully, for some of the people that are attending this live. So what situation you find yourself in, and then hopefully that'll benefit the other folks listening in on the recording after the live session. So some of the trends we're seeing that we're already seeing taking shape is a proliferation of what we talk about when we talk about operations management. So with DevOps or organizations that are following a DevOps methodology, we're seeing multiple types of organizations either sharing or taking on full responsibility for operations management practices and functionality. So that's bringing up a different set of situations depending on where your organization is with that and where you've started from. We see it's not just a central IT organization or an IT operations team that is driving everything. There have been different trends over the years in the market when it comes to how IT operations is handled. So of course we still see a predominant methodology when it comes to a central IT organization or multiple groups that share that central IT role. But the trend is changing where it's not necessarily a shift, but it's a trend outside to complement what a central IT organization is doing. So we're seeing already that around 40 to 50, roughly half of organizations that have been surveyed and researched are starting to do what we refer to as operations management, handling issues that come up with applications or the application stack or the services that they rely on. They're handling those outside of a central IT group, and that makes sense because you have more and more workloads going to the cloud as represented here. That's expected to continue. You have the applications that are used to manage those workloads being more cloud-based. So it makes sense that the people doing that aren't going to go out and, if you own an application or a set of applications, your goal in life is to develop and deliver that application, not to manage an infrastructure stack. So as that fluidity and as that flexibility becomes more and more attainable for different teams, we could expect this trend to continue. So we're seeing the expansion of operations management activity. So when there is a problem, it may be that you're not necessarily primarily having a role in operations management. You may not consider yourself an operator or a site reliability engineer or an operations engineer, but you may be a developer. You may be someone that is probably the most knowledgeable person about your application and the functionality therein. And it may make sense for you to be the person that could be a first responder when things go wrong with that application. And that's why we're starting to see some of these trends. Anand, anything?
Hey, James,
I'll offer for you to jump in as much as possible here. Yeah?
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike. You wanted to say something before I jump in here. This is Anand from Jenny.
Well, either one of you guys, but it seems to me, is there some sort of like crisis that emerges that drives this change, or is it a bottoms-up kind of phenomenon, or what drives people to kind of shift the way they're thinking about DevOps?
Yeah. Let me add some comments on that, and then I'll hand it over to James after that, if you don't mind. So we look at traditional software companies trying to offer SaaS-based offerings. And what is really happening there, for example, for them is they're really becoming service providers, right? Which means that they need to think about operations. Traditionally, they bundle software, shrink-wrap software, and provided installation, on-prem kind of stuff. But now they need to worry about infrastructure because they own the problem of making sure the software itself is available for the customer and is running and humming away. That's a traditional software company. Now, if you take CSPs as communication service providers, they're becoming more, software-centric service providers because they're trying to offer more services on top of their existing infrastructure, whether it is data centers which they own or network infrastructure they own. Now, when you look at all this, the big challenge for enterprises now is they have to deal with sort of a hybrid environment of multiple infrastructures for a single application which they might be utilizing or hosting, and they're reselling. They have to deal with the private, public clouds and a SaaS-based application. So DevOps is in the middle of this because it makes everything actually happen, if you want to say, end-to-end. Because no matter what, now the operations people become, the DevOps operation guys become critical to make sure this service is up and running. So we look at, CSPs as a good example, people who have data centers and along with their infrastructure, and they're maybe dealing with a bank, a set of bank branches and so on and forth, and they need to provide more visibility into the CSPs, operational health and data back to the enterprises themselves. So they have a better visibility to do operational health on their side, on the services they're hosting, and so on and forth. So that's causing the big change, and that is something we're seeing both from an enterprise standpoint and from a CSP standpoint quite extensively, actually.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that, Anand. So, Mike, to your question, the other aspect of it, in addition to what Anand was mentioning, we're seeing more self-sufficiency, or the desire to be self-sufficient on the part of the application owner teams that typically follow a DevOps approach. And so the person that is in charge of the early parts of the development cycle of any given set of apps wearing multiple hats. And it could be that they also do deployment, that they also do the ongoing operations, both through the early pre-production parts of the development lifecycle, but then beyond. Once things are in production, they have a hand, or maybe even own the ongoing issues. Could be the flip side of what Anand was talking about, where, all right, they may not own the infrastructure. That may all be cloud-based, but they do own the apps that are dependent on that infrastructure. So it becomes more of a challenge sometimes, where you don't have necessarily visibility into everything you're dependent on, but you have enough visibility where you can at least help out when problems start coming up.
And one more thing to that, James, is the app owner is doing continuous delivery of the updates to their application, and that's traditionally we used to see them like if you made a release, you made once every 6 months, or if not even longer sometimes. So someone needs to update. But this is continuous delivery of that changes, which makes a tremendous amount of human correlation if you didn't have a system, which can actually give you a unified view of what's happening across all the stacks of this hybrid stack that James is talking about, right? You don't own the infrastructure, but you need to know what change is going to impact your service availability.
Yep. So yeah, and I know, Anand, we're going to try to get into some of that soon here. So Mike, I think looking at the time here, do we want to look at the first polling question?
Sure, why not?
Okay. All right.
All right, guys. Here's our first polling question. Where does your company's operations management happen today? Please select 1. All in one central IT ops group, all outside a central IT ops group, a mix across central IT and other groups, development, ops, and deployment, and finally, external service provider. And guys, while we're waiting for everybody to vote, what do you guys think? Where will this land, do you think?
I think I'm expecting some level of a mix, but I'd be happy to be surprised one way or the other. I don't know, but Nan, about what you think. I don't know how long we have for putting in our predictions to prove ourselves wrong there, Mike.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to just say that, if I were to predict something, I agree with you. It's going to be a mixed bag for sure. But a lot of people will say, I see some results there, which is nice.
All right, so the results would indicate that you guys are on top of things, because 46% said it's a mix, but 28% are still in one central IT ops group, and a full 24% are in some sort of development, ops, and deployment mode. So I'm just curious, what's your take on that, guys? Because what's interesting to me is like 0 was all outside central IT.
Yeah. I didn't want to taint. I hope I didn't taint the voting too much. I didn't want to taint it any further. This is in line with what I was expecting. We're seeing and it's in line with where the stats were that we're getting back, right? Where we're seeing a mix. And it should continue to be that way. I would expect it to be that way for the foreseeable future, especially with larger organizations where you have an established, mature set of best practices and teams. And as things proliferate, they're going to want to be working with in a constructive manner with maybe the application teams, the DevOps teams, lines of business that tend to have a lot more ownership or additional ownership of their own destiny, so to speak. So this is definitely reflective of what we've been seeing. And I know you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I do. I agree with James. We see that, when you look at certain types of applications and services which enterprises have to deal with, they're in different groups, and that's what is a reflection. And certain infrastructure type of applications, are in a more centralized, if you want to say. So it is very much in line with what we hear from customers. It's very much in, for example, if you take an MSP as an example, you'll see that they're more centralized versus an enterprise. For example, they're not as centralized.
Yeah. So this really helps us tee up the next topic that we wanted to share some thoughts on. So since this is where a lot of people are, where it's a mix across different types of teams, where you have some central IT ops and usually years of practice going on there, and you have some other teams that are taking on more and more operational responsibility. You could have a varying level of skills, experience, knowledge base, and what we're definitely seeing is, like Anand just mentioned, a different set of approaches. So the traditional approach was reflective of the technology and the layout of the infrastructure and the application stack at the time. That's not just obviously that takes a long time to transition from, and some companies, they're going to want to continue to maintain their own infrastructure, right? They built their own power plant. It makes sense for them to continue to do that, and so there are some, definitely some use cases for keeping a more traditional set of infrastructure that you manage. At the same time, you have other teams that we see are, whether they're newer to, they're new organizations or they're modernizing. They've taken more of a cloud-first approach, and that lends itself to a much more agile mode from the start. So we're seeing different starting points happen depending on the mix that we just reflected there, and that brings different methodologies and different situations as well.
Are you guys worried, or maybe the customers should worry more about the concept of technical debt? Because sometimes I see people building systems of engagement that duplicate functionality that's already in the systems of record. So do people need to have a clear idea of delineation of services?
Yeah, I think so, and I'll give you a chance to comment on that. So you're going to have some situations where things are centrally controlled from the governance standpoint, and they, they're successful at keeping everybody in sync. But I think it should really be expected, even if you're really diligent and have a mature organization. The trends we're seeing here lend themselves to more decentralized, and what we crossed out there, and we're starting to hear more democratized control. And sometimes that could be, there could be a set of trade-offs with that, but there's a lot of benefits to doing that, taking that approach. Where we're seeing when things get out of balance is people run into some of the same problems, and it could actually, like you said, Mike, it could actually create more complexity than you really need, and it defeats the purpose. So part of what we're seeing people facing is they have things running smoothly in a structured format, and then somebody, a team, for a lot of good reasons, a lot of business critical reasons, will go and maybe recreate the wheel some or do something on their own, and it leads to inefficiencies and a lot of extra cost.
Yeah, let me add. If you take a traditional bank, we deal with quite a few banks actually as customers. Their PCI compliance requirements is a good example. It doesn't matter your systems where they are. You still need to collect the data to be able to report on that as expected by regulation and so on and forth, right? So when you look at those kinds of systems, so you're really looking at a traditional deployments of those systems, existing systems, and they don't want to touch those yet, right? So those are the kinds of things you face in the transformation when it's happening to the agile world, if you want to say, that they need to keep in perspective when they roll these services out, where they want to be, faster and more dynamic in the digital economy, and that forces them to think differently sometimes because of that legacy requirements which they have actually,
Yeah, and Mike, and this, one of the reasons why we're highlighting a lot of this is because we want to see a constructive approach, right? We want to help, of course, companies that are in these situations and are facing these different disparities, different points of entry into this situation. We want to help them with, approach it constructively with open arms. So rather than be have an operations team or a more traditional central IT ops team be a gatekeeper or blocker to more agile, more fluid, continuous development and deployment, we want to help, of course, them drive that forward and be a part of of a more fluid flow. And then at the same time, on the flip side of that, for the teams that are more highly agile, we want to keep, help them prevent some of this, suffering some of the same fate that have happened over the years, or running into some of the same problems that could actually be either prevented or mitigated by just leveraging some of the tried and true best practices that the traditional teams have already been doing for some time. So it kind of lends itself to where there's a happy medium.
Okay. I'd like to make one more comment, Mike.
Sure.
Go ahead, James. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to just add to that, a couple of things, right? If you look at, some of the service providers who are trying to, leverage both the private and public clouds infrastructure, still have to deal with, some of we're talking about PCI compliance or security compliance, and so on and forth, right? So if you take a software service provider who's providing, a way to tunnel into an ATM machine somewhere, for example, and they use typically a Stun server which is sitting in a public cloud, and all the Stun server is doing is helping you do the NAC translation so that you can tunnel back in. But where I'm going with that is, to give a simple service like that, where you're doing, 10 million connections, one of our experiences that, we've dealt with in the past is they're doing a significant number of connections back to these remote devices and edge devices and so on and forth. And you need to understand the change and what the impact of that is, both from as a DevOps person. If I'm going to spin up new instances of these Stun servers, what does that mean, and how do I log? How do I correlate all that information so that I know, the primary goal is being met? And the primary goal is really to remotely address the issue to reduce the cost to repair, right? You don't want to do a truck roll to the remote device to actually go and fix the issue. And so the DevOps engineers is in the middle of all this, because they are dealing with microservices kind of environment. They're spinning up new instances to handle the extra load, and so they have to have a unified view of both these traditional systems with the what you call as the cloud-enabled systems, to unify the events across and see, make better judgment, not completely relying on multiple screens or multiple lack of unification, right? And having to, swivel chair like, the old days. I think we've come a long way in the traditional mode, if you want to say, if you were to take IT operations in the non-cloud environment, if you want to say, they've come a long way going to one screen. The last thing we want to do is give them multiple screens and create a chaos in trying to understand, how do I correlate this data across multiple screens actually. And so unification is key, is going forward, because a small change introduced has a significant impact across multiple systems. So that unification is what we see a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And on, hold that thought, because we want to continue on that one for sure and dive into it some. So, Mike, should we move to the next set of polling questions?
Yeah, let's do that, guys. All right, here we go. All right, everybody, vote for one of the following. How agile is your organization? Please select one. Highly, predominantly, minimally, and not agile at all. And everybody who's got your Vegas betting hat on, what do you guys think is going to happen here?
I wouldn't want to put too much money on this one. I think we're going to see somewhere between minimally and predominantly, but I think it just depends on perception. So if you're thinking you're highly, that means you're rolling things out continuously every minute or hour or daily. So if you're actually having apps that are rolling out on that fluid basis, you can call yourself highly. If you're doing it maybe every week or every month, you might be predominantly. But unless you're at that point, okay, good. All right, we got some some responses back. So this is actually where I expected it. So I feel like I'm tainting the voting, Mike. But the there are definitely a mix, and this is reflective, of course, back to the situations that people find themselves in. And so we expect this to continue and actually pick up. So the top two, of course, we'll see much more highly agile environments. And some of that depends on the nature of the app, of course. Some of that depends on how much infrastructure you do have to manage, how much you can detach your ability to roll things out continuously from that. And we know there are a lot of factors that go into it. Either way, you're going to suffer some of the, or you could run into some of the same problems, and sometimes it's harder if you don't have clear visibility in all those parts. So I think that's where, Anand, you were heading, and we can pick back up on that.
Let me just ask you a quick question now. How important is this at this juncture? Because it seems like if everybody's going to become a software company in the future, the rate at which you roll out new apps is, of course, important, but it's also the quality of the apps. So how do I balance those two things?
Yeah, and this is where we start getting into, having some empathy, depending on which side you come at it from. It could be that you have roots in operations, and there's a lot of discussion about operations needing to be mindful of what has to happen earlier in the life cycle. And this is where we start talking about shifting left, and operations shifting left to be more empathetic and more mindful of what can happen earlier in the life cycle that could actually prepare for better deployments and better rollouts. But we also are seeing a lot of companies and a lot of organizations that are taking a DevOps approach, that acknowledging that there needs to be empathy on the part of the development teams and the people that have roots in development and primary roles doing development of apps and the rollout and deployment of them. And that's where we start talking about shifting right, or at least having the mindfulness of understanding what happens after things go into production. What could you do differently leading up to it? If you have a better understanding of the big picture, and you know what causes problems to your apps that are already out in production, or you know what types of issues or hotspots or problem areas there might be with whatever you're dependent on, whether it's something your company controls or you're doing through a service provider or through a public cloud. If you know and have some cognizance of what to expect there, you may make some different choices earlier in the dev cycle, and definitely test differently and deploy differently. So really, if there can be a sharing of best practices, if you will, a sharing of the ways that people have approached this, then it helps create a good balance between the different goals that are associated here. Anand, I know you wanted to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I do. So, I mean, this is a very interesting concept. I mean, I really like this, what James just talked about, shifting left and right. The reason is that if you look at traditional software practices and processes, they're pretty mature in nature when it comes to building, deploying, and testing, right? What they're not really good is the so-called release in the DevOps world, in the cloud world, where you're continuously deploying, or whether you're doing that daily or whether you're doing that on a weekly basis, it doesn't really matter. You still need to have the concept of how do I manage that deployment, and how do I understand what's going to happen every single time, so that I can actually look out what kind of automation I can do, and how do I prioritize, the noise which is created during that process, right? This is a critical piece, and this is something what DevOps, really the critical piece of DevOps, the new changes coming into their lives, right? Which is what they're not used to in the past, is the ops coming into the dev teams. So that is a fundamental shift in how the responsibilities are and how someone needs to think through and so on and forth. When I look at a simple example, like a large enterprise who has thousands of outlets which they're connecting to a CSP, as an example, who's providing them the infrastructure, both the backhaul network and a data center, and so on and forth. Now, the enterprise, all they care about is, hey, I'm using your infrastructure. You tell me when I make a change on my side, what's happening there? And they are the app owners, and they're the dev side of the house, right? Now they're starting to wear the hat of the ops, and then at the same time you have the the CSP actually has an ops team. So there's a tremendous amount of collaboration between the two which needs to happen, and that's the a fundamental requirement going forward that people need to think when they say that, hey, I'm minimal in terms of being agile. They have not established these collaboration across the borders, if you want to say. We like to call it as Chatbox, right? Basically doing chat across operational teams, right? And solving problems more in a higher speed, if you want to say. Is a simple example. And you could not think like 5 years ago you wanted to do knowledge bases, but once you establish certain processes, you don't have that luxury anymore. You need to do that now.
Yeah, and I think, Anand, we want to definitely keep going on that. And I think some of the things that Anand was referencing, there are some best practices that can be leveraged from years of operations management disciplines, and you don't have to. There are things that teams can take advantage of now that are at the level of maturity and at the ease of use where you have an experience where you don't have to have a lot of that skill set or experience in operations in order to take advantage of them. And that's like Anand, you just mentioned, right? Leveraging some methods of creating more automation at each step of the life cycle, and then having that carry over into the reactionary, inevitable reactionary issues in production. So I think we want to dive into that some more. First, Mike, I think we have one last polling question, if I'm not mistaken.
All right, here we go, guys. One last polling question. If you would all participate, please. Which of the following areas of responsibility do you have? Please select one. Development only, operations only, both development and operations, but no deployment. And then finally, development, operations, and deployment. And again, please pick one. And where do you guys think this is going to wind up?
Good question. I'm thinking the trend here is a mix, right? Where things are in both camps, but be interested to see what our audience is really, which point of view our audience is coming from.
I think there's a difference between accountability and responsibility that is subtle here. All right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's interesting. So 45% do have some kind of responsibility, and I think that's like you said, Mike. There's accountability and responsibility. What we're seeing where people get into trouble is when the responsibility is mixed like this. There's two sides, right? There's a lot of fluidity. There's agility that can be gained from it. At the same time, some of the issues that we've brought up could be something that either hold you back, causes disruptions, things that you don't plan for, that you have to take on, and then other things that you do plan for that may or may not go exactly as intended. So why don't we move forward? It's really interesting to get that result. Okay, let me get this restarted. So to pick back up and on what some of the things you were saying. So what we're seeing, and the results there reflect it, where you have responsibility shared across teams. We've established that. That requires some more collaboration, of course. It also, it lends itself to the situation, Mike, that you raised, where you might have different teams that, especially in a really large organization, doing, trying to achieve their goals, and that might lend itself to doing things in a duplicate manner, whether that's adopting different tools or whether that's going about deploying apps that may or may not play well together, so to speak. And so some of that, of course, is a challenge. And then there's the intended results where you may have you may have a planned rollout, you may have a planned set of changes at hand through a pipeline, and of course, though nobody's perfect, there could be situations that come up with what you do have planned. So amidst all of those things that everyone should really probably expect, you also have things that are just unforeseen. You have different types of organizational changes that may impact you. Maybe that there's acquisition, maybe shifting around of different roles. Those, of course, always have an impact. Could be that some business initiatives might change. It might be hard to work on one thing, and then all of a sudden something else becomes more important. And then, of course, there's always the other external stuff that affect all of us. It could be as simple as the weather, especially a lot of the things that a lot of people have had to deal with lately. That's a big factor. Could be some kind of disaster, some kind of external thing like a cyber attack. All these things really are becoming more and more grounded and really hit home when you're trying to understand, just manage your apps and keep, your part of the world going. And that's where we start getting into refining, how, or really focusing in on how you work smart and not try to chase every single alert that comes up, because you may have some alerts that are definitely critical, that are real and reflect the need for immediate action. But you're also going to get a whole bunch that are just going to be noise, and we all suffer from this, right? Just the way my phone goes off on any given day, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I don't need to pay attention to, but for some reason I set it up so that my phone tells me I need to pay attention to it. The same thing applies in an operations situation or in a DevOps situation, where you may have a lot of tools. It could be a lot of logs that people are using, they're chasing or causing, hitting a threshold to some extent. It could be monitoring tools. It could be the change and configuration tools that you're using as you go through the life cycle. There's a whole bunch of different ways to sources really that could be the cause of the change. And then, of course, all these external factors could be something that come into play. So the key is to really focus in on how you're detecting and pulling those things in, how you're going from a whole bunch of noise and a whole bunch of different types of alerts, alarms, events, and pulling them together, correlating them in a smart way. These are all best practices that have been developed over the years and that you can take advantage of regardless of your level of experience in them. And not only just identifying, hey, there's a whole bunch of things going on that are related, that we've correlated, but automatically prioritizing them, or prioritizing them in a smart way that's pertinent to your situation, pertinent to your business and operational priorities. And then making sure people know about them, the right people know about them. You don't want to notify people on everybody on everything. You don't want to spam. You don't want to send out alerts and texts to the wrong people at the wrong time. You definitely want to wake up the wrong person when they really don't need to be on the weekends. And then, the way that, as Anand was mentioning before, collaborating. So a lot of situations that arise, usually depending on their level of severity, depending on their level of impact, it may be that you're wearing multiple hats and you can handle everything and get to the point where you're actually investigating it, diagnosing it, and resolving it. But a lot of the times you need the help of either a teammate, you need to work on things together, or it's the appropriate thing to do is to delegate it or hand it off to someone with more subject matter expertise. So all of these things, if not done properly, can be a source of delay. They could be a source of, or a cause of more severe consequences because things aren't being done promptly. So the idea here is to really embrace all of these factors, get smart about how you're pulling them all in, and get smart about how you handle them and make them manageable. And Anand, I know you had some good examples here. I think that stadium example you were mentioning before this, I thought really brought this to light.
Yeah, let me add that. I mean, we can spend quite a bit of time here, but so let me distill it and go to the stadium example. You know, a stadium is an example, but you know, any dense facility as general, right? Malls, stadiums, all of these. You know, typically you go from a low usage to a peak usage when you're coming to a network such as Wi-Fi or you know your cell coverage, things like that. The technology behind which enables a lot of that today, you know, many people don't realize, but it is quite virtualized in nature. You know, there's hybrids of virtualization which happens where the backend systems, you know, what they refer to as NFV, network function virtualization, and they're very dynamic in nature. So when you're in low usage, the same backhaul which is used for regular enterprise operational functions at a facility or such as a stadium is the same as what they use for you know, when you become peak usage, when an event is happening there. And so when change like that happens, you will see quite a bit of difference in the peak usage of different applications. So you introduce additional resources to cover for that, and that's even a bigger change in terms of the topology of the network, supporting that app or the event which is happening there. If you have an app which is actually streaming that event and it needs more additional resources, you make further changes. So when you look at all of those changes, you gotta have a pretty good idea about that, you know, before and after, and more importantly, the life cycle of those changes which happen over a period of time, because you learn a lot from it. You know, you want to detect, to James' point, you want to detect, James, right up front, so that you're not doing this, you know, when I said detect, you know, correlated detect, right? You don't want to just rawly detect every event and produce that in front of the human who's trying to understand what is a high priority or a low priority. So what is correlated, you know, with that historic information based on the change, you're better positioned to prioritize what's important, what's not important. The next thing is, I want to go back to the Chatbox. Because of the backhaul systems and because of the app team that's going forth in an environment like that, Chatbox is something, again, I want to bring up a little bit here. Collaboration needs to happen. If it doesn't happen, any change is not realized across the teams in a very real-time fashion, only causes more pain in terms of what is the root cause of the issue, and as a result, they'll be trying to address a different side of the issue rather than trying to understand what the core issue is. And you know, so when you look at things like that, like weather is a good example, or any information which is coming like that, you know, would add to a centralized team which is managing that change effectively. You know, needs that data so that they can actually correlate this information. So we look at, you know, when we look at this, you know, kind of information, we see, you know, customers wanting to do a couple of things, right? One, they want to log every change. They want to log every event. This is great, but what they don't realize is that the value they get from logging all that is to learn from that data and applying that change information back into the system so that they can actually, you know, correlate more efficiently in an automated way. If you didn't do that, the amount of data you get back from all these siloed teams is so huge that, you know, without automation, you cannot make, you know, great progress to isolate issues and resolve issues which are service impacting. So that's what we see. You know, we see a big trend, customers wanting to do more of that automation, and we see customers want to learn more from their knowledge from the past, and they want to log everything, and they want to collaborate more, and they want to use that collaboration data against the knowledge base so that they can actually leverage that as learnings as they go forward. You know, this is a big trend we see, and we can spend a lot of time on this one actually in terms of what's happening, what people are trying to do.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good examples here where you may be in a situation where you have extreme variance of the number of users, like a stadium example, right, where you have all week long, no consumers of critical applications, and then come the weekend, all of a sudden you have tens of thousands of consuming people and everything that's needed in order to support that. And then enabling yourself and the team that has to support it, it could be across different teams, like reflected earlier in the discussion. Being able to set up, so knowing that you're going to have that adjustment. And if you're in a more steady situation where it's not such extreme, part of a consuming model, you still are subject to a lot of the different challenges that come about from constant change, constant rollouts. And that really adds a different aspect and different dimension to the picture that DevOps teams are having to be are facing more and more. So that brings us to what we really want to leave you with is that you don't have to leave best practices at the door, right? Even some of the things that have been used over the years in a more traditional sense, they're very applicable to a DevOps situation. Yet at the same time, you can't just expect to use the same old technology, same old tools in every situation. Sometimes you're going to have a mix, depending on where you are and how much you've invested in these types of things in the past. There's a complementary way to approach it to embrace some of the new workloads. It could be that you're in the middle of some transformation and you're struggling with some of the things we mentioned before, where you still need to keep things rolling out in an agile method, yet you're making, you're almost causing more your own source of change, where you're either transforming where those workloads are, the applications that you're building, all these things start to come together. So all these challenges, all this mixture of teams, the different types of obstacles that are faced when you're trying to collaborate across different types of teams and different organizations or companies, this is what we have in mind when we talk about event management and incident management. And so Jenny, Anand's company, Jenny, has been a very successful organization when it comes to helping people meet these challenges or overcome some of these challenges over the years. And there's all kinds of cool examples about in every type of industry. Definitely the service providers, as Anand mentioned, but even you think of like some of the other examples where you have a very fluid environment, extremely fluid environment, where it's just an example of extreme situations, and they've been helping companies overcome that for many years. And what we've done is our approach from an IBM standpoint is we've leveraged years of best practices and created some new cloud-based offerings that allow you to match and fit wherever you might be in that spectrum, right? You might have a small portion of your deployments going out into a public cloud or a private cloud. You may be working in a hybrid situation where you have your part of your teams are managing their own infrastructure still, and also trying to manage some of the newer workloads in the cloud. Wherever you might be, we've applied some of the best practices and the tools that you can leverage right away. So with Cloud Event Management, you can get up and running in minutes, and you can leverage a lot of the automation right out of the box that is in there, that lets you go from establishing where all those sources that we talked about could be coming from, bringing them in, correlating them in an automated way by picking and choosing point and click through some sets of criteria that are pertinent to you, and then establishing some criteria through a point and click method to establish priorities and how you want your teams to be notified and become aware of events and the incidents that we correlate those events into, and how you want them to either become aware and acknowledge that they're working on them, or collaborate across different teams. And so these functions and these best practices and the tools that enable you to achieve them really will help you hit the ground running right immediately, and they set the bar, right? I mean, this is why we've got years of best practices under our belt where we have companies that have seen where they've been chasing false alarms and it's caused disruptions, where they've been having duplicates across different teams, and you have different teams unknowingly chasing the same problem, and we've helped them overcome that. And the good news is we can pick up where we left off, leverage some of the newer offerings that make sense to a DevOps team and we think are a really good fit, and leverage the best practices and methodologies that we talked about that really drove the development of those tools. So, Anand, anything you want to mention on this?
No, thanks. The one thing I do want to say is simplicity is the name of the game for any solution in this space. Any solution which simplifies the operations is what you want. You do not want a solution and a tool which has to be enabled over a period of many, many weeks, if you want to say. And James, I'm really hats off to your team that you're able to do this in minutes, not days or weeks, if you want to say, right? And I think automation is fundamental to anything going forward. If you can automate something, that means that you cannot deal with ongoing issues. So we see this from our customers, and I have to say that having seen the IBM solution, it's definitely a leader in it. The simplicity and the usage aspect of it is really elegant, actually, and really proud to be associated with it. And hats off to that team.
All right. Great. I think we have time for a couple of questions, guys, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
We would encourage the audience to ask some more questions as well. But our first question comes from one of our attendees wants to know that now that we're seeing T-shaped teams and DevOps unified teams, is monitoring going to be part of this equation, or does monitoring continue to be a separate exercise, or where does it fit?
Yeah, so let me share a couple quick thoughts on that, and then you may want to elaborate. So monitoring, we see monitoring definitely being part of this. Monitoring is one, when I think of monitoring, I think of tools that help you measure performance, measure what's happening either within the infrastructure itself at the resources level, or more pertinent to some of the themes we're talking about here at the application level. So that could be a response time performance, it could be availability. So those are a major factor, and what you'll see here is what you want to do is make sure that you're not that you're embracing whatever the teams might be using. So in an ideal world, everyone would be using IBM's monitoring tools. That's something that we're not going to hold our breath for, and in fact, the nature of the mixture that we reflected here in some of the audience and what we expect in the market, you're going to have people going out and doing their own methods. You're going to have people using their own tools. We work with a lot of customers that try to rein that in so it's structured at least, but you don't want to limit yourself. So the idea is to embrace the fact that you're going to have some heterogeneous situations there. You want to be able to pull them in at a higher layer, a level that where you don't have to worry about what teams are using. You're going to be able to correlate duplicates. You're going to be able to correlate like type of alerts then when thresholds get crossed from different monitoring tools. So monitoring is definitely a part of it, and there are other methods like we mentioned before, where you've got logs and different sources that could be triggering off their own alerts that may not come from directly from a monitor. So you want those to be part of the picture as well.
All right. Let me add a little bit to that, James. I think understanding the symptoms is important before an actual event happens where it's a traditional fault. The only way you can understand the symptoms leading to a fault is by monitoring. So you got to understand the endpoints, you got to understand the application health, and see where that's going. So you can actually do other things in an automated fashion that you can launch a new instance to cover for it and switch the service when the service comes away. So I think monitoring is more foundational, especially for cloud-based applications and then hybrid infrastructure-based applications where everything is more virtualized.
All right. Our next question, guys, goes to the issue of IT operations management methodologies. And our question basically goes to the root of, we have been managing IT operations for several decades now. So are there methodologies that can be brought forward into this DevOps world, or do I have to start over entirely?
Yeah, so just that helps us reiterate some of the key points. So definitely, as we've heard said, don't leave your ops brain at the DevOps door. I think that's definitely a lesson that can be, if we can stick to that. There are best practices as far as how you bring in all the different types of sources that could be relevant, and how you treat that, and to do things in a smart way, as we've mentioned before. There's the people, process, and tools aspects that have to all come together. So if any one of those is suffering, and if you've been dealing with that challenge from an operations management standpoint for years, you definitely want to leverage what you've built up, because it's all very applicable to a DevOps scenario. In fact, even more so that we try to establish here, where if you've got different types of expertise and really different focus, right? If your main focus is to do development on an app or a set of apps, you're not waking up in the morning to open up service tickets and investigate operational incidents. But at the same time, if you put that in the context of, hey, you want your application to be successful, you can definitely learn from some of the years of best practices associated with this, and leverage the layers of automation that Anand mentioned that could be instantly applied.
I'll definitely echo to that one. Yeah, I definitely want to echo what James said, because he's spot on. I think you got to leverage what you have invested over the years and start from there. And at Jenny, we do this quite often, where we go do a health check to customers to understand their operations and help them with that, so that we think of a roadmap and come back and say, a lot of times we look at their existing operational processes they have, and you start from there. If you're a much more recent organization, then there's slightly a different approach there, where you leverage all best practices which other people have done, and that's, again, you can come to an organization, Jenny, which can help you with that. But really, you jump from where you are. Don't try to take a bigger leap. You leverage what you learned over the years, and you have expertise there, and that's been our approach to this.
All right, great. Guys, that's all we have time for, and I guess I'll leave you all with a thought from the great Oscar Wilde, who said that the true sign of intelligence is the ability to expect the unexpected. And with that, I want to thank our speakers for sharing their knowledge and their insights, and I want to thank you all for spending the time with us. And we do encourage you to visit devops.com and check out all the other content we have there, especially upcoming webinars. Thank you all, and have a great day.